concretely this far as the crisis is concerned. Let us note that the current constitution, which is the revised constitution of the country, which was revised in January 1996, was principally to accommodate the Anglophone problem. Following the All Anglophone Conference 1, the AAC 2, and the Zero Option. All of these mopped up the government to precipitate a constitutional reform policy which came up with the 1996 constitution, which I should say never was implemented to the latter. An article in that constitution talked about implementing it progressively. And I want to say that more than 20 years after, major elements of that constitution, which, like I noted earlier, were intended to accommodate the Anglophone problem or the Southern Cameroons problem, was hardly tackled. Another policy intervention by government was the creation of the National Commission for Bilingualism and Multiculturalism, giving the impression that the Southern Cameroons problem was a problem of language, the bilingual nature of Cameroon or the multicultural nature of the country. Wrong. That was not the essence of the Southern Cameroons case. The Southern Cameroonians did not go to the streets because they were claiming bilingualism or multiculturalism. So this government in policy intervention is just to dissuade international opinion as far as the Southern Cameroons case is concerned. The third policy option would be the creation of a common law bench at the Supreme Court, of course, which has very, very little impact as far as the Southern Cameroons case of marginalization, that is putting them to the margins of power, is concerned. And of course, when the Southern Cameroonians protested about their improportionate representation in the highest school of administration in the territory, the government policy intervention was to create new departments in that National School of Administration and Magistracy. And let me note that these special departments had to be done in such a way that it goes on for 3 years, especially the recruitment of Anglophone or Southern Cameroonian magistrates for a period of 3 years. Let me note that this 3-year period has come to an end. And what is the consequence? We go back to the usual exclusion, marginalization, and discrimination of the people of Southern Cameroon. The next point we should consider as government policy intervention on the outbreak of the Southern Cameroon strike, especially from the 2016, was the translation of the French Ohada laws into English. Permit me note that the issue of the Ohada law was not and has never been the problem of the language, because it was translated, it was a French version that was translated into English without the common law principles and practices within those laws. So it simply means that laws which are predominantly supposed to be effected in Francophone Africa has been imposed on the people of Southern Cameroons by that mere translation. We can go on to talk about the recruitment of 1,000 bilingual teachers. Let us note that government policy intervention was to recruit 1,000 bilingual teachers. And by bilingualism, it simply meant that they had to recruit people who speak English and French. Cameroonians basically are English-French bilingual. So it means that anybody who could speak English and French was subject to that recruitment. And that was not the case. That was not the question put in place by the Southern Cameroonians. Their main concern was that many people who spoke one language, that is French language, were recruited to teach in schools of predominantly English-speaking Cameroonians or Southern Cameroonians of the Northwest and Southwest regions. One interesting policy intervention was, of course, the major national dialogue. We all understand that that dialogue was not constituted by well-defined agenda from both sides of the divide. It was incumbent for those who organized that national dialogue to allow the people of Southern Cameroons to constitute themselves first and select those who could properly articulate their wishes and aspirations to attend the dialogue. But unfortunately, that policy intervention was one-sided, getting government officials to select those people they wanted to attend such a national dialogue. And of course, the outcome of that national dialogue as a policy is what we wrongly interpret as the special status, because many are Cameroonian, or many are Southern Cameroonian, or many of the international communities adhere to the view that after the national dialogue, there was a special status granted to the peoples of Southern Cameroons. Wrong interpretation. The special status is contained in that constitution which was revised in 1996. So policymakers and politicians simply did not properly articulate that Article 62 which existed in the constitution which had lasted for over 20 years. So it would be foolhardy for the international community to be dribbled into the fake notion that there is a special status that is an outcome of the national dialogue. And of course,
because of time, I may have to hold you at this point. You can take other aspects of this discourse.
Okay, just the last point.
Okay, fine.
If you permit. Now, the most important thing I want to say is that the greatest utility of all of these government policy intervention has been that it has rather helped the Southern Cameroon's case to be valorized the world over. So for every measure that the government has made as a policy intervention, it should rather open the eyes of the international community that there is a people who have genuine reason to complain and who have brought their plight to the global stage and which calls for global intervention. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Before you go, let me ask you a question. You made observation here that there exist several actors on the side of Southern Cameroon who were not given time to organize themselves and select those who represented the major national dialogue. So who are really the actors in the Southern Cameroon faction vis-a-vis the government of Cameroon? Bearing in mind that there's also international community that are also making input into the process. Can you tacitly identify the critical actors in this challenge, these Southern Cameroon questions?
My dear brother, I will not follow you into that trap. My keen answer is very clear. I do not have any particular leader in mind. My answer is clear. That the Anglophones, the Southern Cameroonians, should be allowed to come together in a conference to select their leaders who could properly articulate their views without any sides being preferred. But of course, we understand that there are leaders who are in the field. We have the Sisekos, the Yerimas, we have the Sakos, we have all of the other so-called leaders who are found in the diaspora and within Cameroon. But unless these people come together by themselves and act properly, select who should articulate their problems, I think it will be wrong for us to say this is a major leader against the other. And that is why we are saying that the government of Cameroon or the international community should facilitate a process where all of the so-called leaders come together in a conference of Southern Cameroonians and select by way of voting those who can adequately represent their tendencies. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. At this point, I would not want us to finish this session without looking at the human rights, the right issues involved in this Southern Cameroon crisis. There have been contending views. If, as previous speakers throughout the day have highlighted, that as incidents happen, there are contending views to who actually perpetrated what. How do we reflect on the Southern Cameroon, or on the human rights violation in Southern Cameroon issues? I can see Professor Yangwe now. You can come online, please.
Okay, thank you very much. At last.
Yes.
I had some technical difficulties. I want to appreciate you, moderator, and thank you very much for moderating this particular panel. I won't be too long because I see we're running against time. I want to make some very quick points as I get along. The first point I want to make is I hear people talking about the Southern Cameroon having joined French Cameroon. That is not correct. We federated with French Cameroon under certain terms. There can be no gain the Southern Cameroon stood to get by becoming a part of French Cameroon. So that must be very clear. The second point I want to make is the use of violence or terror by French Cameroon. This is the DNA of French Cameroon. Right from the word go, everything for it is violence. That is its nature. The third thing I want to make is that this conflict we're talking about, many people don't tend to see it. It's a resource conflict. If the Southern Cameroon was some barren piece of real estate, French Cameroon and France would not be fighting over it. The reason why they're fighting over it is because of the huge resources that the Southern Cameroon has. And they want to have unimpeded access to those resources. Another point which people tend to overlook is that there's a certain phenomenon which emerged in Africa after white colonialism ended. And this is a phenomenon which has been called black on black colonization, whereby certain countries that had smaller ones by their side, because they thought these were small countries, they could turn around and grab them and make them part of their country. We saw that this is what happened in Western Sahara and Morocco. This is what happened between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Even Libya tried to do that by seizing the Aouzou Strip. So this is a new phenomenon, and it is surprising that the African intelligentsia and the continental organization hasn't been able to detect this, hasn't been able to see this, and keeps on repeating the usual song that colonialism is ended in Africa. Well, it hasn't ended, because there are African states that are trying to colonize some other state. And that's why in the case of the Southern Cameroon and Amazonia, we are resisting that new form of colonization. We cannot accept it. And for that reason also, we cannot accept the so-called special status. Nobody on this earth, no authority on this earth has the right to give to the people of the Southern Cameroon any status. Only the people of the Southern Cameroon can determine their own political status within the international community. So to hear that a group of people will sit in Yaoundé and claim a right to be able to give, they say that giving us that is very preposterous, and they have no basis for that at all. The further point I just want to make also relates to, since we're talking about a war situation, to call attention to the fact that this war which is going on, there are two things I want to draw attention to. First one is the resort to force in international law and the waging of national liberation struggle. First of all, let us remind ourselves that the use of force is permissible under international law to enforce the right of people to self-determination. If you look at any international law book, you look at UN documents, that is very, very clear. Secondly, we know that the conduct of war is subject to legal restraints. Countries don't go to war, parties don't go to war and conduct the war anyhow as they want. The purpose of international humanitarian law is actually to constrain the use of force. But when you look at where Cameroon is behaving, Cameroon is conducting its colonial war in Ambazonia with the maximum cruelty, ruthlessness, and barbarism you can ever imagine. This is how it conducts its war. And like the previous speaker, one speaker already mentioned, the international community is quiet about this thing, and therefore, by necessary implication, enabling French Cameroon to perpetrate this despicable act, and is not lifting a finger. On the issue of national liberation wars, I must say in 1977, wars of national liberation are now considered to be international armed conflicts. And so the armed conflict in Ambazonia is, in fact, French-Cameroon's colonial war in Ambazonia, just like France had its colonial war in Algeria. So this war is a war of national liberation. It is an international conflict. So it is not, as people have said, some people have said, who are not informed, it is not a non-international armed conflict. It is not a domestic affair of French Cameroon. French Cameroon has no right whatsoever in Ambazonia. Before 1972, French Cameroon could never, ever, ever say that the Southern Cameroon is part of French Cameroon. It has only been able to do so because it has annexed Southern Cameroon. And so the thesis of black on black colonization. And finally, as I said, the use of force in these wars of national liberation is fully justified. And because of the way Cameroon is conducting its liberation war in the most brutal of manner, I will suggest and I will contend that it is making things very, very difficult for peace to be achieved, to sit down with people who have blood on their hands in that manner. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yangwe. At this point, we'll still have some time for maybe one or two questions. Part of our concern is to assess the conflict, bearing in mind its implication. To one, education. We all agree that since September, October 2016, there have been strikes in parts of Southern Cameroon, especially the suburbs. Now, there have been increasing loss of lives and property, including human displacements. Thousands have left Nigeria as refugees. Now, there have been breakdown of social norms. Traditional institutions are being violated. In fact, just some 3 days ago, I know I heard about a particular fund whose house was invaded by bandits. Now, there's increase in criminalities. Previously, these things were strange, that such sacred traditional institutions are being violated. But it's going on. Kidnapping is on the rise, and senseless murder is going on across the Tiesa area. Bearing this in mind, how do we look at the way forward? What do you prefer, the way out of this conundrum? I feel open to panelists.
Could I just chip in there and just say one brief comment? This whole question you're raising there about kidnapping for ransom and so on. This is a peculiar modus operandi of the French occupation forces. What they do, they have what they call Calais. Calais in French is a cordon and search operation, where they swoop to a particular area, usually it's in the night, on early mornings, and they arrest everybody they find. So what they do is they go to specific areas, they arrest, well, we're calling arrest, but actually I really seize people, hundreds of them, and you'll be intrigued to know that they require that parents should come or family members should come and take away their family members, each of them paying 500,000 CFA francs. That's the equivalent to about, I don't know if you convert that to US dollars, you see how much it is. Then imagine that if they had just 100 people, how much money do they make out of that? And we have intelligence that these soldiers are doing these things, these French Cameroon soldiers are doing this because they say they must enrich themselves before the war is over. So I'm surprised that our brave journalists who are outside don't pick up this thing.
That is just one aspect of the organized criminality going on in the conflict area. We are all, critical observers have taken note that there have been some kidnapping for ransom perpetrated by people on the ground beside the critical thing at this point is that arms have gone into the hands of people who ordinarily should not be making use of arms. Even that there's speculation that even if the conflict ends today, armed violence, armed criminality will continue in the territory. Because the people who were initially scared, who expect a policeman with a whistle, now take up arms and kill a policeman, kill a soldier. That is an invitation to more problems. If we have to take this observation to be valid, and bear in mind that schools have shut down. And unfortunately, the incident in Fiango Kumba recently, or last weekend, is not provoking. Bearing in mind that children that have right to education have gone to school only to be killed. Human displacement. I see a situation where there will be major demographic distortions in the region in the next couple of years based on this conflict. The critical social norms are being violated. People believe in charm. People even go to sacred institutions to violate it. Parents, the mere fact you have a series of murder in most callous ways, and sacred traditional institutions are being neglected. This shows a breakdown to social norms. Having this in mind, as people who are concerned on building the new Southern Cameroon, what is the way forward? I can invite other Eti Tembong to come in, and Professor Willie Broad Nzewa wants to come in. I'm also interested in what we expect from the international community, as well as the various competing Southern Cameroon groups, who all have one shared objective, liberation, while also have varying and competing and conflicting approach to it. The floor is open, please, the panelists.
Again, let me, before my fellow panelists put the ideas, let me just say the question you ask are very, very relevant. But we are not reinventing the wheel. We've seen this happen in many other countries in exactly the same scenario. And what does the UN do? Let me just give the example of Kosovo, for example. What the UN goes in there, puts in a force. They get all the armed groups in certain area, look at them. And there's a whole process of demobilizing them, taking the arms and so on. And at the same time, training the civil
police. Let me hold you on that. You see, for the UN to come in, the government of Cameroon had to welcome them for peacekeeping mission.
That's where we differ. That's our contention on the issue. Because they're making it a domestic affair of French Cameroon. And we're saying, no, it isn't. This is an international issue. They should come in. So, and like the previous one speaker also makes it and said that the international community is enabling this military option by French Cameroon by maintaining the fiction that the Southern Cameroon and Bazonia is part of the territory of French Cameroon. And so therefore virtually giving French Cameroon a right to veto the international system and say, don't come in here. For example, we've challenged them. Each time they say it is our liberation fighters who have actually done A, B, and C. And we said, fine. If you are saying so, you should not object for an international investigation to come in. If they are the ones to be caught and so on. But you know what? It's French Cameroon that have always been objecting to the coming in of a team of international. And my reason for the reason why I think that I would suggest the objection is because they know their hands are dirty. They will dig out a lot of dirt, and they don't want that to be known. That's my contention.
Okay. Can we have from other panelists, please? Thompson, Professor Crawford, Gordon Crawford.
They're muted.
It's Willie Broad, please.
Okay, fine. Come on, please.
Willie Broad is.
Okay. Yes, thank you very much. I actually did not follow my brother, Professor Anyangwe, but the preliminary statement he made was very important, and I totally agree with him. But it will be very important for me to make this statement that the divided nature of the fighters on the ground and their leaders abroad has transformed the fight in the ground, and having instead the Southern Cameroonians as targets. I say it so because I live in Cameroon. It has become a threat. You cannot go anywhere. You cannot go home. For some of you, for example, who have been able to follow social media, despite my commitment and 23 years in this struggle for justice to the people of Southern Cameroons, there was a video that was circulating with my picture with the name Blackleg, We have decided to use the name Black Leg now to target anybody who does not belong to our tendencies. You cannot pass through Bafut, for example, to go further than that because you will be picked up. So my appeal is that the Southern Cameroonians who reside within Cameroon should not be the targets of those who are fighting for the freedom of their territory. I want to agree that in as much as we have divided schools, it will be incumbent on the leaders to actually regroup themselves and rethink their strategies and the punishments that they are giving to their people on the ground. I think I want to make that statement. The punishment is largely by the government side, but the divided forces and the divided generals with divided leaders have made it in such a way that it is not very easy, even with the people in the remotest of the villages. I wanted to say that and make this appeal for the fighters and their leaders to get to one commitment, that commitment to talking with one voice and not targeting theirs on the ground. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Libro. Can we get some questions from the audience? Is it possible to get some questions from the audience for the panelists? Hello?
Everybody muted.
It's possible. They can type their questions in and then we'll read them on the air, or in some cases, because of the technical difficulties we're having, if you're in an area where you can unmute and talk, we could manage that. You could raise your hand and we'll unmute your microphone. But I think the best way to go would be to just have them type their questions, read them so that there's enough time for panelists to respond. Please type your questions if you have any.
While we wait for the questions, is there any other panelists that have an intervention to make at this point?
Okay, in the absence of my other colleagues, I heard
there is, Prof, there is. Yes. I think I see Dr. Chris Roberts.
Okay.
Can the control room please unmute his microphone? Because I know for many of us, if your microphone is muted, you cannot unmute by yourself. Can you unmute the microphone for Dr. Chris Roberts? Kevin, in the background, the control room, please. And someone take care of that. So I still see, if he's talking, we can hear him.
Yeah, we are trying to, at the back end, to get people unmuted, sorry.
I can see Effie Tempong says he had been logged, signed off the panel. Control?
Yeah,
Control? Can you revisit Effie Tempong, please? He's urging to come back to the panel, but he's been signed off. Hello? Chris Roberts? Okay, yeah, come in, please.
Yeah. While that is going on, while they're trying to fix things, let me just say, I hear my brother and what he says, but please let's not exaggerate some of these things. I've heard this kind of complaint before or statements. I think it's unfair for the fighters for us to expect that. It's not like, first of all, they're not a professional army. These are individual groups in their various communities that spontaneously took arms. To get them together, it's a process, and this might take a while. So let's not make it, oh, you don't have one army, you don't have this, and so on. No. Secondly, these guys are not trained guys. The kind of discipline which we're expecting from them. These things will take time. And secondly, in the process, I think we must acknowledge that there are some of them who have realized that the things they are doing by targeting people in the community is not a good thing. An effort is being made in that direction to rectify and correct these mistakes. And we must acknowledge it. To continue singing and saying that are doing A, B, and C, I think it's unfair for people who, without no training, took up arms to defend the community and the people and their families. Thank you.
Yes, no problem.
Okay. We respect.
If you permit me, can I make just a swift statement?
Okay, come in.
If you permit. Yes, I totally agree. I totally agree with my brother, Professor Carlson. But what we are saying is that we are not as exaggerating. We agree that the forces on the ground are not very trained. What I was saying is the leadership out of the country who put the pictures of people within the country and call them black legs. I am a living witness of it. My picture was circulating, and I challenge everybody who is watching us now to put my name on Google and see my contribution towards social justice in Cameroon. So what we are saying that the leadership, some people unceremoniously just decide to take the pictures of some people and put over the media and call them blacklegs. So unless the leadership, if the poor soldiers on the ground do that, we can understand because they're not trained. But when it is coming from their leadership from abroad, that is where we have the problem. So it means that everybody who lives in Cameroon is automatically a blackleg. So that's why the appeal is that the leadership should be very systematic and professional in their declarations so as to get concerns even from those Southern Cameroonians who are living within Cameroon. Thank you.
I just wanted to
your point. You are right.
May I just say something concerning the question you raised about the non-intervention by the international community? I find blaming the people or the leadership of the disingenuous because there's something called the responsibility to protect. And Cameroon has failed awfully in its responsibility to protect. We've seen more than 800,000 children not able to attend school in 4 years. We have seen village after village, hundreds of villages razed to the ground. We have seen elderly people who are not able to escape when the military invades their homes, burned in their own homes. So these things are happening in plain sight. There's no one who can give an excuse that is because of those people. In some areas, they've said that both sides are to blame. To me, that is a very to me, that is not acceptable because the bigger force in this fight is the Cameroon government, supported by the international community. They have arms provided to them by the United States. They have by Israel and even France. They have soldiers trained. These guys on the ground are barely fighting for their lives. They are fighting to protect their families. So I think it's a huge failure of the international system to stand up for a people who have been peacefully fighting for their rights. And so what the message they are sending to the world is that peaceful change cannot work because the leaders of Southern Cameroons, including Foncha, Dr. Foncha and Muna, had led a delegation to the United Nations to ask for the intervention to discuss these issues, including even Dr. Munzu, who is now on the other side. All of these leaders were involved at the beginning, trying to seek a solution to what's going on. But to see the fact that they turn away, to me, that they cannot blame the people in Southern Cameroons for non-intervention of the international community.
Thank you very much. By implication, you began by saying that the government of Cameroon have failed in its responsibility to protect. And I'm tempted to also draw inference that you also say that the international community on its own part have also failed in responsibility to protect and protect our civilians in armed conflict. Is that what you're saying also? Mr. Tembong, are you also implying that the international community have also failed in its responsibility to protect, especially with respect to protection of civilians in armed conflict, since they allow the carnage to be continuing going on in that scenario? Remember, there are allegations and counter allegations that both the government accusing the Ambazonian fighters and the Ambazonian fighters on the other hand also accusing the government. So if you must impact, and some reports by the human rights groups tend to indict both groups, I would not say that international community on its own part have actually failed. I see a question here asking what is the role of the United Nations and African Union in addressing this conflict. I can see a question here by one Bali. What is the use of the United Nations and African Union in addressing this conflict? Can someone look at this critical before we proceed on rounding up for the session. But time is fast approaching.
Could I answer a couple of questions that I've seen pop up?
Please go ahead.
Okay, so there was a number of questions. What Effie was just talking about in terms of responsibility to protect is absolutely the important central focus. But we need to understand that R2P has three elements. One is the host government has the responsibility to protect its own citizens. The second stage is the international community has a responsibility to help that country protect its own citizens. And then it's only the third option, which is the international community now has a right of intervention, but because of the way the legislation or the international law developed, the international community does not have an obligation. You can't force the international community to act without it wanting to act. And so that means that we all have to, in our different countries around the world, use every kind of strategy and tactic and suggest options to our governments, to our politicians, to our leaders, to say, look, there are things that we can do and things that we can do better. The United Nations itself, responsibility to protect, the third option, the intervention without consent of the Cameroon government, is not on the table in the short run. That requires a UN Security Council resolution, and we know that China, Russia, perhaps France, perhaps the United States, perhaps the UK would veto it. And it only needs one of those countries to veto. So there's other pressure points within the United Nations system. The United Nations General Assembly has power that's not often used, but is there. The African Union, the EU, the Commonwealth, the Francophonie, all of these international organizations, as then well as the IMF, the World Bank, of which for instance, my country, Canada, sits on the executive director board and is approving these loans to the government, which of course is driving me crazy as a Canadian, let alone a political scientist. There are all sorts of things we can do, but responsibility to protect for all sorts of reasons is not on the immediate agenda of intervention without consent. However, as earlier today and as other people have pointed out, the idea of perhaps promoting the idea of a fact-finding mission through the United Nations or other auspices, of which our French politician Nadeau mentioned this morning and others have mentioned, that can be a priority. That does not have to be without consent. There's other things that we could be doing in our countries. In Canada, we're working on getting the government to consider targeted sanctions, economic and travel sanctions for individuals involved in atrocities, because we have legislation now that can do that. It's the Maglinsky and other sets of law that other countries have as well. So there are all sorts of different pressure points. We can't look at one, we have to look at them all simultaneously and see which ones can be pushed in different countries. The point only being to get the international community to, on one hand, stop enabling a failed military strategy of the government, to get them to a negotiating table. And that's what I think other people are trying to do in the international community.
Thank you very much. Well,
Yeah, there are two questions there.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a question as to two questions. Why Cameroon history is not taught? I think there is one, Mr. Awa, why Cameroon history is not taught in the university. I think that's not true. The history of Cameroon was introduced in the University of Cameroon by Professor Fanso Verkijika. And that history has been taught, was introduced to the Anglo-Saxon system. And the GCE board started practicing that a long time ago. The history of Cameroon was not taught and is not taught in Francophone schools, but it is taught in Anglophone schools. That is why the people of Southern Cameroon are more aware of the history of Cameroon than the people of French Cameroon. That's it. I think I answered that question. The next one is, why is the UN not imposing a buffer zone? Right. I think that's very interesting. It is interesting because I have often argued that the UN should mean what they say and they should say what they mean. We know that the game of international relation is a game of international interest, of permanent interest. And it is very, very, very vital for everyone to call on the United Nations to take their responsibilities if they are a union of Nations. But do not forget, while they are trying to consider the Union of Nations, some of them argue that they are dealing with governments and not with peoples. But we forget to understand that the people of Southern Cameroon are a people who were a former United Nations Trust territory. So just this year, we're celebrating the ceasefire, international, the call for ceasefire. I think it is important for the United Nations to practically intervene and establish a ceasefire, because the logic of the government of Cameroon is they cannot accept that notion of ceasefire, because if they do, they will be recognizing the other side. So that is why they're not thinking about ceasefire. So when the United Nations says ceasefire, ceasefire, they should follow up and intervene to impose this buffer zone. If they are only waiting for the government of Cameroon to impose the ceasefire, they will never do it, because it will be an over recognition of the other, which they would not want to. So it is incumbent for the AU. Well, as for the AU, they will not, I will say it very clearly, they cannot overtly do, because the African Union argues that they are dealing with states. It's a club of independent states, and therefore they do not recognize Southern Cameroon as an independent state. Just an anecdote, I happen to have taken part in one of the sessions of the AU, and there is a burning problem between Morocco and the Sahrawi Arab Democratic Republic. Now, let us note that it's a club of independent states, and that is why the AU will play within those club, the club of friends, as I can say. Thank you very much. Maybe the two questions, just tackle them as.
Okay, you're welcome. All right, our time is actually fast spent. I will have to commence the concluding sessions of this program, this panel. Now, I will invite Atta Milan. Hope he's still on, to give us the key takeaways from this panel discussion. Milan? Hello, Milan? Is he muted? All right, control. I can get across to Milan while I give some remarks.
Okay, can I come in?
Please come in now, yes.
Okay, thank you very much. Can you hear me? Thank you, Mr. Moderator. Can you hear me?
We're hearing you, yes, you're very audible.
Okay, thank you very much. My role was to do a lot of listening, and in the process try and pick up what I think might be takeaway points. And I think that's what I've tried to do. Listening to the various interventions, I think intervention from Mr. Ekitambo made very clear the fact that we are witnessing the story of people who have refused to live in slavery. And he also made mention of the fact that there is a history behind these people. It is one of the first states on the African continent that witnessed a peaceful transition from government in power to an opposition party way back in the 50s. He made a lot of comparison to peaceful processes which have taken place in the likes of the UK with Scotland, in Canada with Quebec, and the fact that in these countries, the people were given the right to self-determination. At least a discussion was had for them to have that kind of conversation, which is not the case of Southern Cameroons. And I think that's something, it's a take-home out of this discussion. Professor Thompson made 3 salient points which I was able to capture. Is the fact that self-determination and autonomy very often gets confused and interchanged. And in the process, not only the confusion and the interchange, but also the fact that in themselves, they are viewed or perceived in a certain manner by the international community. So it is a hard one, it's a hard nut to crack. And that's something that protagonists need to take into consideration. And then, of course, he made mention of external intervention in the likes of Kosovo and so on. But most most salient was the fact that there is the need to be ready and to be able to take advantage of opportunities at the right time in the case where you're looking at self-determination as the path you want to go. So it's all about being prepared, having the right ingredients, and being able to take advantage. So it's all about time and history, which I found to be quite key to his intervention. Professor Roberts came in and talked about the fact that the non-monolithic nature of Southern Cameroons and Southern Cameroonians as a people. And I think this has been largely witnessed in the various interventions of the evening, that approaches, different people have different approaches, different perceptions, and different political schools of thought with regards to the issue at hand, but also that the international community is not monolithic, which means even as we engage the international community, it is important not to approach this community with a one-size-fits-all. Each and every community has their specificities, but also their interests. So the challenge, of course, is how do you then tailor your interactions with these various players across the world in order for them to listen, but also to pay attention. So he actually talked about, in his words, there is the need to use different strategies and tactics in order to achieve this. And most of all, I think he made mention of the fact that the international community does not understand what is going on in Southern Cameroons. This is something that we have all witnessed. We've listened to some of the interventions of the evening or the afternoon in the US, and a lot of the participants have actually made clear that they are only learning about certain aspects of this conflict recently. 4 key points that he raised that were take-home points. The government of Cameroon has decided, and I think Professor Anyangwe also made mention of that, a number of actors have made mention, it is committed to a military solution to what I have called a political crisis. That in itself is a problem, a military solution to a political crisis. Then made mention of the fact that there are donor organizations which keep pumping money into the Cameroonian economy for all sorts of reasons. Specifically, he fingered the IMF. But then his argument was they probably are not aware of what is going on and how these funds are being used. And I think the points, asterisks I put to his point there was, do they? Are we sure they don't? And I think he also asked the questions, especially when these funds are given no strings attached. When one looks at how the Republic of Cameroon handled the COVID crisis recently, it only makes a lot of sense where perhaps those funds could have been channeled. Then capacity building, of course, we all know. He talked about the fact that a lot of resources have been moved towards the fight against Boko Haram, towards the Southern Cameroons, which tells you that the international community is erroneously pumping funds and capacity building into a military that is not fighting insurgency in the north, but rather fighting the fight for self-determination in Southern Cameroons. And finally, he made mention once again of the need for multi-strategies if we want to find solutions, we want to win. Professor Willibrod Zengwa actually talked about, in fact, his was a very, very cleverly crafted presentation that required quite a bit of follow-up. Because what he's saying basically is he's pointing to the games that the Cameroonian government is playing by use of policy positions and shifting course of those positions to buy time. That's what I got out of that. And it talks about, for instance, the Commission for Bilingualism, the national dialogue. You would notice, for instance, that the national dialogue, so-called, was initiated at the time when the international community was pushing for international dialogue outside of the territory. So was that a coincidence, or was it just a mere accident? So it's been what I gained from this whole thing, the shifting positions of the Yaoundé regime, is the fact that the positions are meant largely to buy time while the military is being used to clear and clean up any kind of military resistance on the ground. That might not have been as successful as they thought it would be, but definitely there is a science behind how they use policy and all these interventions to buy time, but also give a certain impression to the international community about the fact that the government is doing something about this. Professor Ayangwe came in, he was straight to the point, very clear that we need to be very careful about the language we use when we talk about gaining independence by joining. This has always been a contentious debate because I have also heard players on the other side talk about the mere use of the word gaining independence by joining as meaning something else. So, but he also cautioned that we need to be clear how that is used. The use of violence as a means of communicating by the French Cameroon, and of course the fact that behind all of this is the need for access to resources, natural resources. And finally, the use of black on black colonization, which he talked about. What I picked up, Mr. Moderator, Professor Okereke, is the fact that I didn't see a lot of conversation around the way forward. Lots of questions were asked, and the moderator also asked, so what is the way forward? There were lots of interventions, but I don't really think that much came out of that. And this is perhaps because it is not very clear. In the conversation and the presentation of the different panelists, they made mention of what could be done here and there, but when it came to really saying, how do we move forward? I didn't hear much coming out of that, but more a lot of problems and challenges being raised. There was, of course, finally, I'm going to conclude very, very shortly. There was, of course, the question of the intervention of the UN, which some of the panelists spoke to, but also the fact that even the panelists, but also some questions which came up quite a few times. Why is the UN not intervening? Again, I think it is important that we get to understand how the UN operates. Last year, for instance, at the UN Assembly, you remember that it is the Republic of South Africa that actually vetoed any kind of conversation or action towards the crisis in Southern Cameroon, so between the Southern Cameroons and La République du Cameroon, on the basis that South Africa felt it was an African problem and therefore needed to be solved through African solutions. I don't think that was the answer to the problem. If you talk to the African Union, you notice that the African Union very often tosses the ball to the next player and says, well, we cannot act unless the CEMAC region reacts. The CEMAC region, as we know, will do nothing because it is, like somebody said, it's a club of nations which are there for each other. So it's based on all of this, I don't know if there is much more time, Mr. Moderator. I think so far I haven't heard from this conversation clear, very concrete suggestions and recommendations on the way forward. Over. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Tamila. I will take you from there. Now, some of the submissions things I was able to identify here is what? That the Southern Cameroon conflict is a resource-based conflict, and that colonialism has not ended in Africa, as different countries still make effort at colonization. Now, basically, the historical roots of the conflict have been traced to the colonial enterprise, especially with the loss of German colonies in the aftermath of the World War I. Next, Southern Cameroon is not a monolithic society, as there exists diversities of opinion. Interestingly, again, it was also pointed out here that several high-level officials in various countries are not well informed on what is actually going on in Southern Cameroon. And by implication, international aid is going to Cameroon, which is committed to military solution, and the financiers are not aware of the money being used for. For instance, say to fight Boko Haram seems to have been diverted to engage in Southern Cameroon question in a military solution. Now again, efforts, there are a bit of okay, thank you. Now, policy interventions have actually been done in isolation with the critical actors. Because in the Southern Cameroon question, are you hearing me now? Is it audible? All right. In the Southern Cameroon question, we've observed that some engagement, there are people in diaspora, there are actors on the ground, and the international actors are like the government of Cameroon. Now, in some of the engagement, those key actors who are driving the armed conflict are often not involved. So Southern Cameroonians, they feel like the national dialogue, the mega national dialogue of last year, Southern Cameroonians should be allowed to bring up their leaders who will now represent their opinion. But coming to the observation with regards to the way forward, that's the observation that the UN is here to take up its responsibility with every seriousness it requires with regards to Southern Cameroon question. Bearing in mind that Southern Cameroon was initially a trustee territory of the United Nations. So some of the recommendations in this area, bearing in mind the AU may not intervene and the Economic Community of Central African States may not intervene, the UN could take a step further by declaring a ceasefire, encouraging the belligerents to embark on ceasefire, comprehensive ceasefire, and subsequently deploy fact-finding mission to the theater areas, while also creating a zone of confidence, which will now be in place to create room for negotiations and mediation that will lead to the way forward. So I think this is like a build-up or follow-up to address the gap which Arthur Miller was not able to address. The emphasis that the UN should take its responsibility more seriously, bearing in mind that territory in question, the area in question was formerly a trustee territory of the UN. Then they should go ahead to declare ceasefire in the area, despite the entry that may go on Security Council, while deploying fact-finding teams. And finally, creating a zone of confidence that will now create room. So the zone of confidence now will create room for the impossible disarmament, while ushering in a regime, a platform for the mediation and negotiation on how to find the lasting solution to the ongoing humanitarian calamity going on there. At this point, and assuming there is no further intervention at this point, we may have to call up the day to close the session. Thank you for panelists for your intervention, and the questions have been quite challenging and unique. Asana. Hello, Asana. You can take off from there. This brings the panel to a close. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Okereke. Thank you. Would like to extend our gratitude to all the members who served on the panel. I'll start by thanking Mr. Milan Atam, who did a resounding job in summarizing some of the very nuanced positions that were made by our guest. Would also like to thank Tyler Thompson. No, he spoke very briefly, but he made some very good points. Special thanks to Effie Tembong. I know you had some difficulties. And then, of course, Professor Willie Broad, Zengwa, thank you for your contributions. Professor Carlson Anyangwe, and of course, Dr. Chris Roberts. Thank you. We remain deeply indebted to you all for remarkable contributions to the panel. Thanks. We are about wrapping up, ladies and gentlemen. There are two quick comments I need to make. The first is that we would like to put it on record that all the frontline groups were invited to participate in this discussion. In other words, all frontline groups received invitations to either deliver an address or to participate in one way or the other in this conference. So there was no attempt to sideline any group, because some people have reached out asking questions. Was Was Sako invited? Was Bo Herbert invited? Was Akwanga invited? And the answer is yes. All those groups, including some more, were invited. And if you don't see any groups, it's either because they chose not to or they did not respond. But the invitation is still open. As you are aware, we have 2 more days. So we're wrapping up day 1, and then tomorrow we're going to have a lot of working groups and panel discussions, and then day 3 as well. And then the last thing I like to put on record is the fact that there are some videos that were not played or were played but not in their entirety. So for cases like that, it's a commitment that we will run all those videos. So they were not in an attempt to either sideline or censor any of our speakers. And on that note, I would like to invite the person who will actually do the last event that we have before closing for today. And that is Dr. John Jongwen. I hope he's present. Dr. Jongwen, if you're present, you're going to have the floor, so you can go ahead and talk about the stuff we have left for today. And then I'll come back and talk about the program for tomorrow. Thank you, and over to you. I don't see him. Is it possible that he is? Let me just see real quickly. Can the technical team in the background look to see if Ajongwen is actually available, but his microphone may be muted? Dr. John, are you there? Can you type a message? You can hear me, but just cannot speak. Type a message so we can get you unmuted. Okay. So in that case, if we're having some difficulties, let me go ahead and wrap this up. We have some working groups that are supposed to meet at the end of day 1. And then, of course, the respective chairpersons for the various working groups that will have presentations and meetings tomorrow have reached out to you if you belong to any of those panels with a link. Okay, I see John is here. All right, Dr. Jongwen, since you're here, let me just say, if I wrap this up and then I'll pass it on to you. If you're serving on a panel tomorrow, please check your emails, because the chairs have sent out emails with the Zoom links for all their panelists. And then the check-in time tomorrow, 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, but we'll be starting like today at 9:30. So over to you, Dr. Jongwen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Asana, and good afternoon, good evening to everybody. And it's really a pleasure to be part of this team here. The part that we're really going to focus on this, the last session of this talk, is really to talk about the working groups themselves. This is really, we've talked about what solutions we have, what is the whole coalition up to, and the great effort that the steering committee did was to put together these working groups that have actually been doing their work for the last, I would say, close to a year, very diligent, coming up and talking to us on different aspects. So before I actually go into the working groups themselves, which I depicted on the chart that is being shown on your screen, I want to just take a step back and say, why was it necessary to even create the coalition, let alone the working groups? There are a couple of points that I want to raise here. The first one is that when we look at how all the different frontline groups and all the actors that have been trying to prosecute this restoration effort, most of the neutral observers looking, especially on social media, what they see is groups of people literally tearing each other apart. And people begin to wonder, do these guys really know what they're fighting for? Do they understand? Because the messages that we were presenting of ourselves on social media were not really helping our cause. and also trying to really let people understand what the problem is, as has been clearly articulated here today. The other thing that this has caused was that we have also heard people within the international communities wondering whether we have the capability to even solve this problem. I'm talking here in terms of the human capacity, what I'll call the abilities themselves to be able to run some of these issues. A telling point was when Secretary of State Ambassador Taibon Energy made a comment that the world is not ready for another Southern Sudan, where they will just end up with another poor country where people will start fighting each other. And the steering committee could see that some of the dynamics that were going on in social media were actually feeding into those type of beliefs and making the international community not really to listen to or understand what message we're trying to put out there. Therefore, the steering committee, having looked at what the core principles were, then took the next step down to look at what it is that we're going to do in order to contribute towards the resolution of this problem. So just a little bit about myself. I'm a chemical engineer by training, biochemical engineer, worked with pharma for over 23 years. And then I did a lot of strategy development and execution, as well as project management. And right now, I own and manage my own financial services operations. And when the committee reached out to me, I thought the only thing I could contribute was really see whether some of the skills I've learned through the course of my working life, I could help coordinate some of this effort. So I am part of the secretariat alongside one of my other colleagues, Professor Gomia. Coming back then to the working groups, the other thing that we need to just talk about is how did these groups come about? The groups were selected based on the idea that if we are able to address these core areas, then it would target like a resolution to, I'll say, 80% of the areas that we can deal with when we talk about nation building or state building. And the solutions that are being proposed are solutions that the team have not just sort of folded their arms. We've heard a lot about our complete desire is to really make sure that the fighting stops. If the fighting stops, then what? Therefore, the working groups have actually been looking at, let's see how we can get ourselves to stop the fighting. But then when we stop the fighting, what are the next steps that we can actually do in order to either reconstruct, rebuild our society? Kevin, if you can throw the first slide up, please, it will be highly appreciated. So the focus areas of the work groups, you see right at the bottom of it as a foundation of anything that we want to do is to make sure that the mediation and negotiations take place. There is a working group that is focusing on this area, and like with every one of those working groups that I'm going to just touch briefly on, the steering committee gave them terms of references on how to develop their work. The one thing that I need to just reiterate, I think Dr. Asana did mention here, is that each of these working groups has literally pulled Southern Cameroonians from across the world. That is, we're talking of practitioners in industry, in academia, in international organizations, in the civic society, as well as groups from representatives from from the different frontline groups. Every one of the frontline groups was invited to provide members to take part in these working groups. Those that were able and willing did provide members, and I am very proud of the working groups because they represent a very, very diverse group of people with different ideologies, different concepts. But the beauty of it is that this group intends to bring together and provide solutions which we see not only solving these fundamental issues, but solutions that whoever wants to pick them up in the future, they can reach back to this team as a think tank, get the roadmap to be able to progress and build for us a just and equitable society, which is really what I am depicting as the roof of this building that we're trying to construct here. The other thing that I want to just mention is that in terms of the terms of references that were given to each and every one of these working groups, they were asked to take a step back and look at the historical perspectives and context of each of these problems, of the current problem through the lenses of their working group. Let me pause here and say that, again, this was one of the concerns and criticisms that we heard from the international organizations. There are some international bodies, some of the countries that have been involved in, that are really responsible for the situation that we face today, either due to failure to fully implement something or the botched implementation. And some of those groups feel embarrassed to talk about it every time that we only come to them and try and tell them that you did not do this, you did not do this, you did not do this. And then they feel like they don't want us to be talking about it. And the more they don't want us to talk about it, the more our problem continues to ferment without any resolution. We also realize that on the other side of the equation, that's on the Cameroonian government side, there is not the appetite there to go into a negotiation. And one thing which really hit me, I was back home then, and I remember seeing this on television when the national television, when the then head of the communications department at the Ministry of Defense, when he was asked how the government could justify the fact that people or that they're like mass casualties when something happens, say a military person is killed, and then the government just goes into that area and sort of attacks or wipes out the whole village. He said, quote unquote, on ne peut faire des omelettes, on ne peut faire des omelettes sans casser les œufs. Translating that, you can't make omelets without breaking the eggs. We all here, we're really feeling the pains. The eggs have been broken. A lot of eggs have been broken. And we know that the situation that is in Kumba the last week is just one of those collateral type of things where eggs are broken. And these working groups were really set up to see how we can stop this and move forward. Therefore, each of the working groups had to look at the historical context to make sure that we understand what the root causes of the problems are and understand that this current situation that we're facing now is untenable, is unsustainable. And then we also gave the working groups the liberty to explore, to do some research, to go out there and look at some other regions, some other countries, some other peoples that have gone through what we are going through now, so that they can do some sort of comparative studies. And then with all of that research and that knowledge, we want them to propose some sort of a roadmap. We know that there's a lot that they're going to come back with, but they were told to pick no more than 5 themes that they were going to focus on in the short, medium, and long term, and then present some sort of findings, which we hope to hear on day 3. It is definitely not going to be a baked cake, but it is there are going to be documents that we're going to work with and go forward. So starting from the mediation working group, the purpose of the mediation group was really to see how they can bring both parties to the negotiating table. That team is putting some real good strategic documents together, and we hope that they will become useful to whoever is chosen to go to the negotiations table. And then on the peace and security building, I position this as a foundation, because if you cannot have peace, then there's no need that we can build this. We'll not be able to build anything on it. We're talking here of the guns have to be silenced. People should feel safe, and then people will be able to go out there and have some sort of clear minds in order to do some reconstruction. And then we looked at the healthcare and humanitarian. We saw a video at the beginning which talks about the refugees. We know that a lot of people are in the bushes. How are we going to make sure that there's humanitarian care to bring these people back? We know that whole villages have been razed to the ground. How they're going to be resettled, and what type of healthcare system do we need in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term? Then we looked at the area of educational and vocational empowerment. This is a very critical area. 4 years now, the kids have not gone to school. There is, and we don't know, by the time we finish, there will be a gap that people would have missed studying for X years. How are we going to cover those gaps? Is the educational system the best one that we really want to take now into the 21st century or 22nd century? Those are some of the things that this working group is looking at. And then the judiciary and constitutional affairs. You know that when we're looking at a just and equitable society, is the judiciary owned by somebody? Is it going to be independent? What did we used to have? What do we have now? And what's going to happen going forward? And then we have the economic and reconstruction. We know what the economic situation right now is. How are we what are some of the robust efforts that we need to put in place to rebuild all the destroyed economy and to move the economy to where it should be? These are some of the pillars that we think should really be focused on. And the key one, which although it's shown as a pillar now, I really say it should be a wraparound, is that of the governance. Because if we do not have the proper governance for the management of the public resources, then all of these efforts that we're putting together would be in vain. Therefore, if you hear this, the working groups have a lot of interdependencies between them, and the different teams have been working together to make sure that the working group that has the most responsibility for any part of those actions takes those, rather than having us dilute the effort. The hope there is that we will start something which would create that roadmap, and then we would identify what resources we have in place in terms of the human, the financial resources that we have right now. And one of the things working with the groups and looking at the capability of all the people that are in the working groups is that we are blessed with tremendous human resources. I was really impressed to see that people who are leading some of these same work groups are the same type of individuals that are leading multinational or international organizations that are dealing especially with this subject matter. So if somebody is sitting there trying to challenge and say, maybe these guys don't have the capability and we need to come support them in nation building, then I don't think that that is the situation. We, as Southern Cameroonians, just need to organize ourselves and we'll be fine. But then there might be some areas that will need financial support. We'll need international organizations to help during some transitional phase in terms of additional manpower and additional financial support. But those additional things, we're saying that we should be able to take it forward by ourselves and get those additions rather than fold our arms and let the international community think that they are the ones that need to come solve the problems as far as these areas are concerned for us. Can we have the second slide, please? So this, when the working group when the steering committee created these working groups, and then they gave them their terms of references as well as what they needed to focus on. The next thing that was whether they really looked at was to see, to talk about the membership and the structure of each of those working groups. What the way that the working groups are set up is that each working group has 2 co-chairs, 2 vice co-chairs, and a rapporteur. Some of them have individuals that have taken the job right from the beginning, and they're running with them. Some of them, because of other activities that they're involved with, have not been able to be there full time. So you get individuals coming in and going out. And what I just listed here are the people that I'll consider the leads in the team, who are really the co-chairs, the vice co-chairs, and the rapporteur. When each of these teams present their work tomorrow, what we expect is that they would take a minute or two to actually introduce the team. As you are aware, we have opened up for other people who feel that they have something to contribute to actually go and join those working groups that are running right now in parallel with this activity, because we want to make sure that all the voices of the people are incorporated in areas that they feel passionate about. The last slide is just a continuation of the members of those working groups, and that brings into the combination of all the 7 working groups and the individuals that have actually come in to help support. There might be 1 or 2 changes here where some of the working groups have co-opted different individuals to work as their co-chairs or vice co-chairs due to other engagements that the other individuals have. But I will allow the teams to really talk about that. Now, how have these